You wake to the sound of metal scraping against stone. The morning light filtering through the narrow window reveals your father standing over a whetstone, sharpening his dagger with deliberate rhythmic strokes. Your mother sits hunched in the corner, her fingers working frantically at her rosary beads, whispering prayers you cannot quite hear. The air tastes of smoke and fear, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Today is your wedding day. You are 12 years old. The silk dress your mother has sewn hangs on a wooden peg like a shroud. Its deep blue fabric, dyed with precious indigo that cost your family 3 months' grain stores, represents everything you are about to lose. Your childhood, your name, your body, your choice. In a few hours, you will be led to the altar not as a bride, but as a commodity. A living contract sealed with flesh and blood, binding two families in an arrangement that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. This is not the marriage you know from fairy tales or modern romance. This is marriage as it existed for most of human history, a brutal transaction where women were currency, children were political pawns, and death was often the only escape from a union that began with violence and ended in the grave. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage contract sprawled across the wooden table like a death warrant, its Latin text swimming in candlelight. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, aged 43, recently widowed, owner of 3 manors and 200 serfs, seeks bride. Available, Lady Matilda, aged 11, daughter of Sir William de Clare, dowry of 50 marks silver, bloodline traced to King Edward. The negotiations had taken 3 days, not because the terms were complex, but because your father wanted to squeeze every possible advantage from your sale. You were, after all, his most valuable asset, young enough to be moulded, fertile enough to produce heirs, and noble enough to elevate his family's standing. The fact that you had never met your future husband was irrelevant. The fact that you were still playing with wooden dolls was inconvenient but not disqualifying. Medieval marriage was fundamentally different from anything we recognize today. It was not a union of equals choosing each other, but a legal and economic arrangement between families, often negotiated when the bride was still in swaddling clothes. The Catholic Church, which would later romanticize marriage as a sacred bond, spent most of the medieval period treating it as a necessary evil, a compromise with human weakness that prevented the greater sin of fornication. The average age of marriage for noble girls during the High Middle Ages was between 12 and 14. For peasant girls, it was slightly higher, around 16 to 18. Not out of any greater respect for childhood, but because poor families needed their daughters' labour longer and could not afford elaborate dowries. But regardless of social class, the fundamental reality remained the same. Marriage was something that happened to women, not something they chose. Your mother's gentle hands shake as she fastens the wooden buttons of your wedding dress. Each button is carved with your family's coat of arms, a swan pierced by an arrow which seems grimly appropriate. She has been married to your father for 16 years, wed at 13 to a man she met on their wedding day. She bore him 9 children, 5 survived infancy. She has never spoken of love, only of duty, obedience, and the careful navigation of a husband's moods. Remember, she whispers, her breath warm against your ear, a wife must be like water. She takes the shape of whatever vessel contains her. Resistance brings only pain. The wedding ceremony itself was a public spectacle designed to make the transaction irreversible. Unlike modern weddings, medieval marriages were not primarily religious events. The church's involvement was minimal, often just a priest offering a blessing at the church door before the real business began. The ceremony was about witness, about community acknowledgement that a legal transfer had occurred. You are led through the village streets like a sacrificial lamb. The entire community is gathered to watch, not to celebrate, but to bear witness. In a world without written records for most people, public ceremony served as collective memory. These villagers would remember this day, would testify if anyone ever questioned the legitimacy of your union or the inheritance rights of your future children. The priest, Father Benedict, stands at the church door with his face carved from stone. He has presided over hundreds of these ceremonies, watched countless young girls led to altars like lambs to slaughter. His Latin words wash over you like water, meaningless syllables that seal your fate. Wilt thou take this man to be thy wedded husband, to have and to hold, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, Till death do you part. You are not asked if you consent. Consent was not a concept that applied to children. And at 12 you were legally a child regardless of your reproductive capacity. Your father consents on your behalf, as he has consented to every major decision of your life. Your voice, when you manage to whisper "I will," is barely audible above the wind. Sir Geoffrey steps forward to claim his prize. He is a stranger to you, but not to your nightmares. You have heard whispers about his first wife, how she died in childbirth at 15, how she was often seen with bruises on her arms and face, how she grew thin and silent in the months before her death. He looks at you now with the same expression a farmer might wear when examining a new horse, evaluating your health, your breeding potential, your likely longevity. The ring he slides onto your finger is not gold but iron, and it weighs more than your small hand can comfortably bear. Iron was chosen deliberately. It was cheaper than gold, but also symbolically significant. Iron was hard, unyielding, eternal. Like the bonds of marriage, it was not meant to be broken. After the ceremony comes the feast, a grotesque celebration of your loss of freedom. The great hall of your father's manor has been decorated with winter greenery and smoky torches. Long tables groan under the weight of roasted meat, white bread and ale. The guests, all adults, all complicit in what is happening, raise their cups in toasts to fertility, to the continuation of bloodlines, to the prosperity of the union. You sit beside your new husband, your feet barely touching the floor from the high chair. He speaks to you occasionally, asking simple questions about your education, your health, your monthly courses. You answer in monosyllables, terror rendering you nearly mute. The food on your plate grows cold and congealed as your stomach churns with fear. The entertainment begins as the evening darkens. A travelling minstrel sings songs of courtly love, beautiful, impossible stories of knights and ladies, of passion and devotion. The irony is not lost on you. These romanticized tales of love have nothing to do with the reality of medieval marriage. They are fantasies, escapist literature for a society that had made real love nearly impossible within the bounds of matrimony. Courtly love, as it was practiced in medieval society, was explicitly extramarital. The troubadours of southern France, who invented many of these romantic ideals, sang of love affairs between knights and married ladies, love that was passionate precisely because it was forbidden and unconsummated. The church condemned these ideas, but they persisted because they offered an emotional outlet in a world where marriage was purely transactional. The cult of courtly love revealed a dark truth about medieval marriage. It was so devoid of emotional connection that people had to invent an entirely separate concept to describe what we now call romantic love. Marriage was about duty, property, and procreation. Love, if it existed at all, was something that happened outside marriage, in secret, in defiance of social order. As the evening progresses, the guests grow drunker and louder. The conversation turns increasingly crude, filled with jokes about wedding nights, about breaking in young wives, about the importance of immediate consummation. You understand only half of what they say, but the leering faces and raucous laughter make their meaning clear enough. Your mother appears at your elbow, her face pale but determined. "Come," she says quietly, "it is time." The bedding ceremony was perhaps the most horrific aspect of medieval marriage. A public ritual that transformed rape into celebration. The entire wedding party would escort the bride and groom to their chamber, offering advice, making crude jokes, and ensuring that the marriage was immediately consummated. The bride's virginity was not just assumed but publicly verified, her bloody sheets displayed as proof of her purity, and her husband's successful possession. You are led up the narrow stone stairs to the chamber that has been prepared for this moment. The room is small and cold, lit by a single candle that casts dancing shadows on the stone walls. The bed dominates the space, a large wooden frame with a straw mattress covered in rough linen sheets. It looks more like a place of execution than a marriage bed. The women in the wedding party undress you with practiced efficiency, their hands impersonal and businesslike. Your wedding dress is carefully folded and set aside. It will be kept as a family heirloom, a reminder of this day. Your shift, thin and transparent, offers no protection from the cold air or the eyes of the gathered crowd. Sir Geoffrey enters with the men, already half undressed. He is drunk, which might be a mercy. Drunk men often fell asleep before completing their task, but tonight he seems alert, focused, determined to claim what he has purchased. The priest offers a blessing over the marriage bed, sprinkling holy water on the sheets and reciting prayers for fertility. The crowd presses closer, offering advice, encouragement, and jest. Some of the men make crude gestures, miming what is about to happen. The women nod approvingly, as if your terror is perfectly normal and expected. This public violation of privacy was not seen as cruel or unusual. It was considered necessary to ensure the marriage was legally binding. A marriage that was not consummated was not a marriage at all. It could be annulled, the contracts voided, the political alliance dissolved. The witnesses were there to prevent any later claims of non-consummation, to ensure that the transaction was completed as agreed. Finally, mercifully, the crowd begins to withdraw, but not before the married women offer their final advice: submit completely, make no sound, think of your duty to produce heirs. Your mother kisses your forehead and whispers a prayer in your ear, her tears falling on your face like rain. The door closes with a sound like a coffin lid. You are alone with your husband, this stranger who now owns you more completely than he owns his horses or his land. You are his property, his chattel, his to use as he sees fit. The law provides no protection for wives. The church teaches that a woman's body belongs to her husband, that she has no right to refuse his advances, that her purpose is to bear his children regardless of the cost to her health or happiness. The medieval concept of marriage was built on the foundation of absolute male authority. The husband was the head of the household, the final arbiter of all decisions, the owner of all property, including his wife's body. The marriage vows reflected this reality. While the husband promised to love and cherish his wife, she promised to love, cherish, and obey. The word obey was not ceremonial. It was a legal requirement backed by both civil and religious law. What happened in that chamber was not lovemaking but conquest. Medieval marriage manuals, written by men for men, offered advice on how to break in a young wife, how to overcome her natural resistance, how to assert dominance from the very beginning. The concept of marital rape did not exist because rape was defined as a crime against property, and a husband could not steal what already belonged to him. The morning after brings no relief, only the continuation of your new reality. You wake to find blood on the sheets, the evidence of your husband's successful consummation that will be displayed for all to see. Your body aches in ways you did not know it could ache. You move carefully, like an old woman, every step a reminder of what you have lost. Sir Geoffrey is already dressed and preparing to leave for his estates. He speaks to you briefly, formally, outlining your duties as his wife. You will manage his household, oversee the servants, receive guests, and bear his children. You will not leave the manor without his permission. You will not speak to other men without his supervision. You will not refuse his advances, no matter how tired, sick, or frightened you might be. The legal reality of medieval marriage was that wives had no independent existence. They could not own property, could not make contracts, could not bring lawsuits, could not even make wills without their husband's consent. The legal doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman was covered by her husband's legal identity. She ceased to exist as an individual person and became merely an extension of her husband's will. Your new home is a fortress, both literally and metaphorically. The manor house of Sir Geoffrey sits on a hill overlooking the village, its stone walls thick and impenetrable. There are no locks on the inside of doors because locks were meant to keep people out, not in. But you are imprisoned nonetheless, trapped by law, custom, and the certain knowledge that there is nowhere to run. The household staff regard you with a mixture of pity and wariness. They have seen wives come and go, have witnessed the cycle of hope and despair that defines the lives of married women. The older servants remember Sir Geoffrey's first wife, how she arrived young and eager, how she gradually faded into silence and shadow, how she died screaming in childbirth while her husband drank ale in the hall below. Your days develop a rhythm of submission and endurance. You wake before dawn to pray, spend the morning overseeing household tasks, the afternoon in needlework or spinning, and the evening in your husband's bed. There is no privacy, no solitude, no moment when you belong to yourself. Even your prayers are monitored. The chaplain reports your spiritual state to your husband, who has the right to correct any deviations from proper wifely devotion. The first pregnancy comes quickly, as was expected and desired. Medieval medicine understood little about conception beyond the observation that young women who were frequently bedded soon showed signs of carrying children. There was no concept of family planning, no understanding of the female cycle, no recognition that constant pregnancy might be dangerous to a woman's health. You are 14 when your first child is born, and the experience nearly kills you. Medieval childbirth was a terrifying ordeal that claimed the lives of countless women. Without understanding of hygiene, anesthesia, or surgical intervention, birth was a primitive struggle between life and death. The mortality rate for women in childbirth was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 10 and 20% of medieval women died from complications related to pregnancy and birth. The midwife who attends you is an elderly woman named Agnes. her hands stained with the blood of 1,000 births. She knows her trade well, but her knowledge is limited to folk remedies and superstition. She places a piece of jasper on your belly to ease the pain, hangs a charm of eagle's claws around your neck to speed delivery, and mutters prayers to St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Labour begins at dawn and continues through the night. You scream until your voice is gone, then continue screaming silently, your mouth open but no sound emerging. The pain is beyond anything you could have imagined. Wave after wave of agony that threatens to tear you apart. Agnes forces you to drink bitter herbs that make you vomit, then more herbs to stop the vomiting. Your husband paces in the hall below, concerned not for your suffering but for the fate of his potential heir. The baby, when it finally comes, is a girl. The disappointment in the room is palpable. A daughter has some value. She can eventually be married off to cement another political alliance, but she is not the son that every medieval husband demanded. Sir Geoffrey's reaction is cold fury. He does not hold the child, does not ask about her health, does not inquire about your condition. He simply leaves the room, already planning the next pregnancy that will, he hopes, produce a male heir. You name the baby Eleanor after your grandmother, though you know the name may be changed if your husband disapproves. In medieval society, fathers had absolute authority over their children's names, education and future. The bond between mother and child, while emotionally powerful, had no legal recognition. Children belonged to their fathers as completely as wives belonged to their husbands. The recovery from childbirth is long and painful. Your body, already small and underdeveloped, has been damaged by the trauma of birth. You develop a fever that lasts for weeks, leaving you weak and delirious. Agnes treats you with more herbs and charms, but medieval medicine has no real understanding of infection or the importance of rest and recovery. Your husband shows no patience for your weakness. Within 2 months of Eleanor's birth, he is demanding his conjugal rights again. You try to explain that you are not ready, that your body needs time to heal, but such concerns are irrelevant to medieval marriage. A wife's body belonged to her husband, and he had the right to use it regardless of her health or comfort. The cycle begins again. Another pregnancy, another difficult birth, another daughter, then another. By the time you are 18, you have given birth to 4 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. Your body is worn out, prematurely aged, marked by the constant demands of pregnancy and childbirth. You look in the polished metal mirror and see your mother's face, the same hollow eyes, the same resigned expression, the same defeated posture. Medieval women lived their entire adult lives in states of pregnancy, childbirth or recovery. The average medieval woman who survived to adulthood would bear 6 to 8 children, of whom roughly half would die before age 5. The emotional toll of losing child after child was enormous, but there was no time to grieve properly before the next pregnancy began. The Church taught that this suffering was God's will, punishment for Eve's original sin. Women were told that pain in childbirth was their natural lot, that they should accept it with patience and humility. The idea that women might have the right to control their own fertility, to space their pregnancies, or to refuse unwanted sexual advances was not just forbidden, but literally unthinkable. Your relationship with your husband, if it can be called a relationship, is built entirely on power and submission. He speaks to you only to give orders or express displeasure. You speak to him only when directly addressed, and then in the most deferential terms possible. There is no conversation, no shared interests, no emotional connection. You are his property, useful for producing heirs and managing his household, but not a person whose thoughts or feelings matter. The isolation is perhaps the worst part. You are surrounded by people but have no real friends, no confidantes, no one who understands your experience. The other women in the household are servants, and the social gap between you makes genuine friendship impossible. The local noblewomen are potential rivals or political enemies, their friendships contingent on their husbands' alliances. You are alone in a way that is both complete and inescapable. Your children provide some comfort, but even that relationship is constrained by medieval custom. You are expected to be loving but not indulgent, nurturing but not protective. The children belong to their father, and he will make all decisions about their upbringing. Your role is to care for them in infancy and early childhood, but once they reach the age of reason around 7, they will be sent away to other households to be educated and trained. The legal system provides no protection for wives who suffer abuse. Medieval law recognized a husband's right to correct his wife physically, as long as the punishment was not excessive. The definition of excessive was left largely to men's interpretation, and the threshold was high. A husband could beat his wife with a stick, as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. He could lock her away, restrict her food, or humiliate her publicly. all in the name of maintaining proper household order. Your husband's violence is not constant, but it is always present as a threat. He strikes you when you displease him, when dinner is late, when you fail to conceive quickly enough after each birth, when you show too much affection for your children. The servants pretend not to notice the bruises, the way you flinch when he raises his hand, the careful way you move around him like a beaten animal. The church, which might have provided some comfort, offers only more oppression. You are required to confess your sins regularly, but the priest is more interested in your failures as a wife than in your suffering as a person. Have you been obedient? Have you submitted willingly to your husband's demands? Have you kept your thoughts pure and your demeanor modest? Your pain is not a sin to be forgiven, but a trial to be endured. Medieval Christianity taught that women were inherently weak, sinful, and dangerous. They were the daughters of Eve, cursed with the responsibility for humanity's fall from grace. The only path to salvation was through submission to male authority and the patient endurance of suffering. The concept of women as individuals with rights, needs, and desires was foreign to medieval religious thought. The years pass in a blur of pregnancy, childbirth, and loss. You bear 9 children in total, of whom 5 survive to adulthood. Each birth is harder than the last, each recovery longer and more difficult. Your body, which was small and delicate to begin with, becomes gaunt and worn. You lose teeth, develop chronic pain, and suffer from what we would now recognize as severe depression. At 25, you are already considered an old woman. Your hair has gone grey, your face is lined with worry and pain, and you move with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has been pushed beyond its limits. You have survived 15 years of marriage, but survival is not the same as living. You exist in a state of constant vigilance, always watching for signs of your husband's mood, always ready to placate, submit, or endure. The economic reality of medieval marriage was that wives were expensive investments that needed to produce returns. The dowry your father paid for your marriage was substantial, but it was only the beginning. Your husband also had to provide for your maintenance, your clothing, your medical care, and your eventual burial. If you failed to produce surviving male heirs, you represented a significant financial loss. This economic pressure created additional stress in already difficult marriages. Wives who failed to conceive, who bore only daughters, or who suffered repeated miscarriages were often blamed for their husband's financial difficulties. The solution was frequently to seek annulment and try again with a younger, hopefully more fertile wife. Annulment was theoretically possible in medieval marriage, but it was expensive, complicated, and heavily biased against women. The most common grounds were consanguinity, being too closely related, impotence, or non-consummation. Proving these claims required testimony from multiple witnesses and often involved invasive physical examinations. Women who sought annulment were frequently accused of adultery, witchcraft, or other crimes that carried severe penalties. Your husband never seeks annulment, perhaps because you have produced enough children to satisfy him, perhaps because the cost and scandal are not worth the potential benefits, but you live with the constant fear that he might change his mind, that you might be discarded like a worn-out tool and replaced with someone younger and more fertile. The fear of abandonment is matched only by the fear of death. Medieval women faced mortality at every turn in childbirth, from disease, from violence, from the simple wear and tear of lives lived without adequate nutrition or medical care. The average life expectancy for women was significantly lower than for men, largely due to the dangers of repeated childbirth. You have attended the funerals of countless women your age or younger, all of whom died from complications related to pregnancy and birth. Each funeral serves as a reminder of your own mortality, a preview of the fate that likely awaits you. You pray for a quick death, for release from the endless cycle of pain and submission, but you also fear leaving your children motherless in a world that shows little mercy to the powerless. The psychological impact of medieval marriage was devastating in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. Modern people, even those who have experienced abuse, cannot easily imagine the complete helplessness of medieval wives. There was no divorce, no legal protection, no social services, no escape. Women who fled their husbands were hunted down and returned, often to face severe punishment. Suicide was considered a mortal sin that condemned the soul to eternal damnation. The result was a kind of learned helplessness that permeated every aspect of a woman's existence. Medieval wives learned to suppress their own desires, opinions, and even their survival instincts in favor of complete submission to male authority. They were trained from childhood to view their own suffering as normal, even virtuous, and to find their only satisfaction in serving others. Your own daughters represent both hope and despair. You love them desperately, but you also know what fate awaits them. Eleanor, now 11, is already being considered for marriage. The negotiations have begun, the dowry is being prepared, and soon she will experience the same terror and violation that marked your own wedding day. You want to protect her, to warn her, to somehow prepare her for what is coming, but you also know that such preparation might be seen as rebellion against God's will. The continuation of the cycle is perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval marriage. Each generation of women raised daughters who would suffer the same fate, who would endure the same abuse, who would die the same deaths. There was no progress, no improvement, no hope that future generations might experience something better. The system was designed to perpetuate itself, to ensure that women remained powerless and men remained in control. Medieval marriage was not just a personal tragedy, but a social system that shaped entire civilizations. The subjugation of women was not an accidental byproduct of medieval society, but a fundamental organizing principle that affected everything from politics to religion to economics. Women's unpaid labor in household management, child rearing and textile production was essential to the medieval economy, but it was invisible and unvalued because it was considered natural and inevitable. The legal framework that supported medieval marriage was elaborate and comprehensive. Canon law, civil law, and local custom all reinforced the same basic principles. Men had authority, women had obligations, and the family was organized around the production of legitimate heirs. These laws were not simply ignored or poorly enforced. They were actively maintained by courts, churches, and communities that saw women's subjugation as necessary for social stability. The ideological justification for medieval marriage drew on religious teaching, classical philosophy, and folk wisdom that all reached the same conclusion. Women were naturally inferior to men and needed to be controlled for their own good and the good of society. This was not seen as oppression but as natural order, divinely ordained and scientifically proven. Your husband dies when you are 32, killed in a hunting accident that leaves you a widow with 5 surviving children. The news should bring relief, but instead it brings terror. Medieval widows faced a precarious existence, legally vulnerable and economically dependent. You have no right to inherit your husband's property. It passes to his male heirs or reverts to his overlord. You are allowed to remain in the household only as long as it suits the new owner's purposes. The period of mourning is brief. Within weeks of Sir Geoffrey's funeral, you are being approached by men who see you as a potential wife. A widow with children and no independent means is still a valuable commodity, especially if she has proven her fertility. The prospect of remarriage fills you with dread, but you have no choice. A woman alone in medieval society was prey to anyone with power and inclination to abuse it. The negotiation for your second marriage is handled by your late husband's brother, who has inherited the estate and wants you gone as quickly as possible. You are older now, damaged by years of childbirth and abuse, but still young enough to bear more children. The dowry is smaller this time. You are no longer a virgin, no longer a promising investment, but there are still men willing to purchase your services. Sir Richard de Vere is older than your first husband, a widower with grown children who needs a wife to manage his household and warm his bed. The marriage contract is negotiated quickly, with little ceremony or celebration. This is a business transaction, not a romantic occasion. You are married in a simple ceremony with few witnesses, then transported to yet another stone fortress that will serve as your prison. The second marriage is, if anything, worse than the first. Sir Richard is cruel in ways that Sir Geoffrey was not, taking pleasure in your submission and pain. He beats you regularly, not in anger, but as a form of entertainment. He forces you to perform sexual acts that leave you humiliated and degraded. He delights in reminding you of your powerlessness, your dependence, your complete lack of alternatives. The psychological effects of prolonged abuse are cumulative. You develop what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, dissociation from your own body. You learn to survive by disappearing inside yourself, by becoming the empty vessel that medieval society demanded women become. Your children from your first marriage are scattered among various households, sent away to be fostered or trained. You are allowed to see them rarely, and only with your new husband's permission. The pain of separation is almost unbearable, but you learn to hide your grief, as you have learned to hide all your emotions. Weakness is dangerous in a world where power is everything. The 6th pregnancy of your life occurs when you are 35, considered advanced maternal age by medieval standards. Your body, already weakened by years of abuse and neglect, struggles to carry the child. You suffer from constant nausea, severe pain, and what we would now recognize as complications related to malnutrition and stress. The birth is horrific. Labor lasts for 3 days, and you nearly die from blood loss and exhaustion. The child, a son, is born weak and sickly. He dies within hours of birth, but not before being baptized to ensure his soul's salvation. You are left empty, broken, grieving not just for this child but for all the losses you have endured. Your husband's reaction to the loss is rage. He blames you for the child's death, for your failure to produce a healthy heir, for your weakness and inability to fulfill your primary purpose. The beating he gives you is the worst yet, leaving you with broken ribs and internal injuries that will never fully heal. Recovery is slow and incomplete. You develop chronic pain that makes every movement agony. Your menstrual cycles become irregular, then stop entirely, your body's way of protecting itself from further pregnancies. But the cessation of fertility does not bring freedom, only new forms of abuse. A wife who cannot bear children is useless, a drain on resources, a reminder of failed investment. The final years of your life are marked by increasing isolation and despair. Your husband takes a young mistress, installing her in the household as a constant reminder of your own inadequacy. You are relegated to the status of housekeeper, responsible for managing the domestic sphere, but excluded from any real authority or respect. The young mistress, barely 15, looks at you with a mixture of pity and fear. She sees in your broken body and defeated spirit a preview of her own future. You want to warn her, to help her, to somehow break the cycle, but you are powerless to change anything. The system that destroyed you will destroy her in turn, and her daughters after her. Medieval marriage was not an aberration or a temporary failure of civilization. It was a logical outcome of a society organized around male dominance and female subjugation. The brutality was not accidental but essential to maintaining a system that concentrated power and resources in the hands of men, while relegating women to the status of reproductive slaves. The economic foundations of medieval marriage were built on the concept of women as property. The dowry system, the laws of inheritance, the legal doctrine of coverture, all these institutions worked together to ensure that women remained economically dependent and therefore powerless. A woman who could not survive without male protection was a woman who could not resist male authority. The religious justification for medieval marriage was equally systematic. The church taught that women were naturally sinful and needed to be controlled by righteous men. Marriage was presented as a divine institution that channeled female sexuality into acceptable forms, while ensuring the production of legitimate heirs. The suffering of wives was not a problem to be solved, but a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of Christian civilization. The social enforcement of medieval marriage was comprehensive and ruthless. Communities that tolerated disobedient wives or abusive husbands were seen as threats to social order. The punishment for women who resisted their assigned roles was severe and public, designed to discourage others from similar rebellion. The few women who managed to escape their marriages were hunted down, punished, and returned to their husbands as examples to others. You die at 38, your body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of years of abuse, neglect, and repeated childbirth. The cause of death is listed as fever, but the real cause is the slow destruction of a human being by a system that viewed women as expendable resources. Your funeral is sparsely attended. Your husband shows appropriate grief for public consumption, but his real emotion is relief. He is already negotiating with the family of a 14-year-old girl who will become his third wife. The cycle continues, endless and inevitable. Each generation of women sacrificed to maintain the power structures that define medieval society. The gravestone, if you were fortunate enough to have one, would bear only your name and the dates of your birth and death. There would be no mention of your dreams, your fears, your love for your children, or your quiet acts of resistance. Medieval women were erased from history as completely as they were erased from life, their stories lost in the silence that patriarchal society demanded. The records that survive from medieval marriage, the contracts, the wills, the legal proceedings, tell us about property transfers and inheritance rights, but they tell us almost nothing about the human cost of these arrangements. We know the names of the men who owned these women, the amounts of the dowries, the dates of the weddings, but we know almost nothing about the women themselves. This erasure was not accidental but deliberate. Medieval society was organized around the principle that women's experiences did not matter, that their suffering was natural and inevitable, that their stories were not worth recording. The few women who managed to leave written records, usually nuns or noble women with unusual access to literacy, wrote within the constraints of a system that punished female self-expression. The psychological impact of medieval marriage extended far beyond the individual women who endured it. The normalization of domestic violence, the acceptance of child marriage, the reduction of women to reproductive functions All these practices shaped medieval culture in ways that persisted long after the formal legal structures changed. The children raised in these households learned that violence was normal, that women were inherently inferior, that power was the only protection against suffering. Sons learned to expect absolute obedience from their future wives, while daughters learned to expect nothing but pain and submission. The transmission of trauma from generation to generation was as systematic as the transmission of property. Modern people often ask how medieval society could have tolerated such obvious injustice, such systematic cruelty toward half the population. The answer is that it was not seen as injustice, but as natural order. The suffering of women was not a problem to be solved, but a necessity to be accepted. The few voices that questioned these arrangements were suppressed, marginalized, or ignored. The economic benefits of medieval marriage were enormous for the men who controlled the system. Unpaid female labor in household management, textile production, food preparation, and child-rearing formed the backbone of medieval economy. Women's bodies were factories for producing the next generation of workers and warriors, their suffering invisible and uncompensated. The legal structures that supported medieval marriage were not primitive or underdeveloped. They were sophisticated systems of control that operated exactly as intended. The complexity of dowry negotiations, inheritance laws, and marriage contracts reveals a society that had thought very carefully about how to extract maximum value from women's lives while minimizing their ability to resist or escape. The religious ideology that justified medieval marriage was equally sophisticated. The Church developed elaborate theological arguments for why women's suffering was necessary, why their submission was virtuous, why their pain was redemptive. These were not casual prejudices, but carefully constructed belief systems that made cruelty seem like kindness, and oppression seem like protection. The social mechanisms that enforced medieval marriage were comprehensive and effective. Community surveillance, economic dependence, legal helplessness, and physical violence all worked together to ensure that women remained trapped in relationships that slowly destroyed them. The few women who managed to escape were hunted down not by individual husbands, but by entire communities that saw female independence as a threat to social order. Your story, like the stories of millions of other medieval women, ends not with redemption or rescue, but with quiet death in a world that never acknowledged your humanity. You lived and died as property, your value measured only in your ability to produce heirs and manage households. Your pain was invisible, your dreams irrelevant, your death barely noticed. But in that very invisibility lies a haunting truth about human resilience. Despite everything the medieval world did to break women's spirits, despite the systematic destruction of their bodies and souls, something essential survived. In the quiet moments between beatings, in the gentle touch of a hand on a fevered brow, in the whispered lullabies sung to dying children, women found ways to maintain their humanity in a system designed to erase it. The medieval marriage was not an unfortunate accident of history, but a deliberate construction, a machine designed to transform human beings into property. It succeeded because it was supported by every institution of medieval society, the church, the law, the economy, the family, the community. It failed only because the women who endured it somehow managed to pass down, generation after generation, the memory of what they had lost and the hope that their daughters might someday reclaim it. The question that haunts us across the centuries is not how medieval marriage could have been so brutal, but how many of its essential features persist in forms we no longer recognize. The legal subjugation may be gone, but the economic dependence remains. The public bedding ceremonies have ended, but the private violations continue. The dowry system has disappeared, but women still bear the primary cost of reproduction and child-rearing. As you close your eyes for the last time in that cold stone chamber, your breath growing shallow in the flickering candlelight, you carry with you the weight of all the words you never spoke, all the choices you never made, all the dreams you never dared to dream. You are 12 years old again, standing in your father's hall, hearing the scrape of metal on stone, watching your mother's fingers work frantically at her rosary beads. The circle closes as it began, with the sound of sharpening steel and the whispered prayers of powerless women, but somewhere in the darkness, barely audible above the wind, is the echo of a different kind of prayer, the hope that someday, somehow, the daughters of daughters yet unborn will wake to a world where metal scrapes stone, not to seal their fate, but to carve their names in history as something more than property, more than vessels, more than the silent casualties of a system that mistook cruelty for order and called it love.